The Lighthouse That Never Slept. Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a coast that doesn't appear on most maps anymore. Not because it vanished, but because cartographers decided it was easier that way. The sea there was known for being overly dramatic, and the locals were said to gossip with the gulls. It was the kind of place where time didn't pass so much as politely hover, waiting to be acknowledged. And somewhere along those quiet cliffs, where the ocean sighed more than it roared, stood a lighthouse, old, whitewashed, and slightly tilted in that confident way only buildings near retirement can manage. Its keeper was a woman named Marin, though she'd probably remind you that names meant very little when your only co-workers were waves and wind. Now, Marin's lighthouse had a reputation. It was called the Lighthouse That Never Slept, which, if you think about it, is rather unfair, because neither did Marin. And yet, no one ever said Marin the woman who never slept, which tells you everything you need to know about human priorities. Let's get comfortable, dim the lights, and drift there together to a world of salt air, soft fog, and one woman's quiet conversation with the sea. The lighthouse had been built long before Marin arrived, back when people still believed that the right kind of tower could outstare a storm. Records of its origin were vague, though they all agreed on one point. It was expensive, and therefore considered essential. It had survived at least a dozen tempests, several poorly thought out renovations, and one incident involving a goat that locals refused to elaborate on. When Marin took the job, she was told she'd be paid in steady wages and solitude, which, depending on your disposition, is either heaven or mild punishment. She didn't mind. Marin liked the silence, or at least, she liked that it listened back. Every evening, as dusk slid across the sea like ink in slow motion, she'd climb the spiral stairs, lantern in hand, hair tied back, boots soft from salt. She'd light the great lamp at the top, clean the glass, and murmur a greeting to whatever stars had decided to show up that night. The stars, to her credit, usually answered, not in words, of course, but in small flickers of agreement. Marin took that as conversation enough. They said she'd once lived inland, somewhere with fields, or people, or possibly both, but she never spoke about it. And the sea didn't ask. What mattered was the rhythm. Light the lamp, check the oil, mend the railing, boil the kettle, and at the end of it all, sit by the round window, watching the tide's slow breathing. Her only regular visitor was the postman, who appeared once a week when the weather permitted, and once a month when it didn't. He'd bring her letters from the harbor office, a newspaper that was always 3 weeks late, and the occasional loaf of bread that had suffered a rough journey. She thanked him every time as though he were delivering gold. It unnerved him deeply. Now, here's the curious thing about lighthouses. They don't just keep ships safe. They keep secrets remarkably well, and this particular one had plenty. Some nights, the light burned brighter than it should have, though Marin swore she hadn't touched a thing. Other nights, the fog wrapped itself around the tower as if it were protecting it, not hiding it. It wasn't until her third winter that the sea finally decided to introduce itself properly. It was a calm night, mostly the kind of stillness that happens right before weather changes its mind. Marin had been sitting by the window, knitting something that would never be finished, as all good knitters know. The point is not completion, but quiet occupation. That's when she heard it, a whisper, soft, like a shell held too close to your ear. At first she thought it was the wind playing its usual tricks, whistling through the cracks in the glass. But then she heard it again, this time clearer, A voice shaped by water. She stood, walked to the door, and stepped out into the mist. The sea below was calm, silver in the moonlight, waves folding gently over themselves like drowsy thoughts. And there, sitting neatly on a patch of wet sand, was a seashell, large, pale, and faintly glowing, as if it had swallowed a piece of the moon by accident. Naturally, Marin picked it up, because when the ocean gifts you a luminous object in the middle of the night, your first instinct should always be curiosity, not logic. The moment her fingers brushed its surface, she heard them, not voices exactly, more like the sound of thoughts forming underwater, dreams of the sea's inhabitants, bubbling softly, layered like music without instruments, a whale dreaming of its mother's call, a crab remembering the rhythm of tides, a school of fish humming the sound of safety. Marin, half asleep and half bewildered, held the shell to her ear, and for the first time in years, she smiled, not the polite smile she gave to the postman, but the small, private one that belongs to people who finally understand something wordless. From that night on, Marin's routine changed, subtly, but completely. She still lit the lamp each evening, still kept her logbook with perfectly tidy handwriting, still boiled her tea until it resembled brine. But now, before climbing to bed, she'd sit by the open window, seashell in hand, listening. She never told anyone, of course. It wasn't the sort of thing you brought up casually. Imagine trying to explain it. Yes, I hear dreams through a shell. No, it's not a metaphor. Instead, she let the sea talk, and she talked back in her own way. Sometimes she'd whisper encouragement to a dreaming seal. Sometimes she'd hum softly for the drifting jellyfish, who seemed to dream in colors. And sometimes, when the tide was especially restless, she'd turn the lighthouse beam slightly, a small gesture, as though she were tucking the horizon in for the night. The ocean noticed. At least, it behaved as though it did. Storms that once battered the cliffs now veered politely elsewhere. The gulls stopped stealing her breakfast, and once, a shoal of silver fish traced a glowing spiral in the bay, just beneath her tower, as if saying thank you. Marin didn't need thanks, but she liked the company. By spring, the villagers on the mainland had begun to gossip. They said the lighthouse had grown brighter, that on some nights, it looked less like a warning and more like a lullaby. A few sailors claimed they saw shapes moving in the light, silhouettes of enormous creatures circling gently in the deep. Naturally, the harbor officials dismissed these reports. They didn't have a form to file for glowing whales of a peaceful disposition. Marin, meanwhile, continued her quiet work. Every entry in her logbook remained perfectly factual. Lamplit at 1942. Weather, mild visibility. Clear. No mention of the glowing seashell sitting beside the ledger, humming faintly. If you look closely, you might notice a note in the margin. Just a single word. Listening. One night, when the air was so still it seemed almost shy, Marin woke to find the seashell glowing brighter than usual. She held it close and heard something new. A dream that didn't belong to the sea creatures, but to the sea itself. It was vast and slow and aching. A dream of being endless yet lonely, of holding so much life, but never resting. The ocean, she realized, was tired. So she did what anyone would do in that situation. She talked to it, softly, through the open window, as though comforting a friend who'd lived too long. She told it about small things, the way her tea steamed, the way the light flickered in fog, the way gulls argued like old married couples, and gradually the waves calmed. Some say that was the night the tides changed slightly, though no one could ever prove it. Marin didn't need proof. She simply kept talking, and the sea kept listening. As the years passed, her hair turned silver, an easy camouflage against the spray. The shell faded too, until it glowed only when she touched it. But the lighthouse never dimmed. It kept shining, steady as breath. Some nights, sailors claimed the light seemed to pulse, like a heartbeat, slow and reassuring. The lighthouse never slept, neither did the sea, but both, somehow, found rest in each other's company. If you visit that stretch of coast today, assuming you can find it, and assuming you bring a map that doesn't roll its eyes, you might see the faintest glow on the horizon, not bright enough to guide a ship, but just enough to suggest someone's still awake out there, keeping watch. And if you listen closely, you might hear it too, a low hum, like waves dreaming of themselves. That's Marin, still tending the light, still talking to the sea, still reminding it that even endless things need a little comfort sometimes. End of part 01. The Keeper Who Talked to the Sea. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, that's either a compliment or a minor failure on my part. Either way, let's return to our lighthouse, still standing on that damp, wind-bent cliff where maps go to take naps. Last time, we left Marin tending her eternal light, chatting quietly with the sea like old coworkers on a night shift. And, as these things tend to go, her quiet, private life didn't stay private for very long. Because of course it didn't. It started with stories, as most inconvenient things do. The fishermen from the nearby village were the first to notice something off. They'd head out before dawn, still half asleep and questioning their career choices, and they'd see it, a pulse of soft white light rolling across the surface of the water, far brighter than any lantern should be. It didn't blink like lightning. It didn't flash like a signal. It just breathed. When they returned, they described it in the only terms available to them, which were mostly probably haunted, and definitely not our problem. Then came the rumors. The lighthouse keeper, they said, never aged. She was in league with the sea. She could calm storms with a whisper, which, incidentally, was bad for business if your livelihood depended on shipwreck salvage. The more the weather improved, the more people resented her. Human gratitude has a short shelf life. A traveling priest eventually made the journey out to assess the situation. As he put it, he arrived in a small boat, carrying far too much religious confidence for a man who couldn't row properly. By the time he reached the shore, he'd been baptized several times against his will. Marin, as always, greeted him politely. She even offered tea, which he declined on moral grounds. Something about temptation and possibly salt. He asked her whether she spoke with spirits, to which she replied, after a long pause, only when they're polite. He wrote that down as a confession. When he asked about the light, she said it wasn't hers to explain, and when he demanded to see the lamp, she warned him it might not like him very much. Naturally, he insisted. He climbed the tower, stared directly into the lens, and promptly fainted, which, in fairness, happens to a lot of people who climb too many stairs in full robes. When he woke, he claimed he'd heard singing, not hymns, but something older, like the sound of mountains dreaming underwater. He left the next morning, visibly shaken, and recommended the lighthouse be left strictly alone. No one argued. Over the years, Marin became a myth with suspiciously good posture. Some said she was the daughter of a sailor and a siren. Others swore she'd once been a ship herself, cursed into human form for trying to outshine the moon. A few insisted she was just a woman who didn't like company, which, frankly, seemed the most believable explanation of all. Children on the mainland would stare out to sea at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the glow. Parents told them it was a star that had forgotten how to fall. Sailors, ever superstitious, began leaving small offerings at the harbor before voyages: seashells, bits of coral, occasionally an entire bottle of rum if they were feeling generous or forgetful. The sea accepted everything. It always does. As the decades passed, time became increasingly uncertain around that stretch of coast. Travelers who tried to reach the lighthouse often found themselves turned around by fog. Compass needles spun lazily, pointing in whatever direction they felt like that day. Some claimed the cliff itself moved, not dramatically, just enough to make you question your sense of direction. And through it all, the light never faltered. Every night, steady as breath, every night, whispering across the dark. Those who managed to reach it, a rare and occasionally soggy few, said the keeper looked ageless, not youthful. Exactly. More preserved, like something the sea had decided to keep rather than erode. She'd welcome them with a nod, perhaps offer a chair that creaked like an old sailor. And she always asked the same question: "Did you come to listen?" Most didn't understand what she meant. A few did, and those few were never quite the same afterward. One visitor, a cartographer by trade, which means a person professionally confused by coastlines, left the most detailed record. His name was Henrik Voss, and he described himself as an enthusiast of remote geography, which is another way of saying not good at parties. Henrik arrived on a calm autumn afternoon, notebook in hand and hubris in full bloom. He expected an aging lighthouse keeper, possibly eccentric, possibly senile. What he found was Marin, quiet, sharp-eyed, and deeply unimpressed by maps. She made him tea. He made polite conversation about tide charts, and after a while, she asked if he'd like to see something unusual. Naturally, he said yes, because when someone who lives alone on a cliff offers to show you something unusual, curiosity outweighs survival instinct every time. Marin handed him the seashell. It no longer glowed. Henrik held it to his ear, expecting silence. What he heard instead was himself, not his voice, but his thoughts, echoing back at him in the rhythm of waves. Every fear, every doubt, softened and reshaped into something gentler. He dropped the shell. Startled, it landed soundlessly, as if the air itself caught it. Marin smiled faintly and said, "It remembers who listens." Henrik's report later described the event as deeply inconvenient to rational thought. He retired from cartography shortly afterward and took up gardening, which was safer and less philosophical. Years turned into decades, centuries, perhaps. The lighthouse stayed. Marin stayed. The world around her changed in all the usual noisy ways. Kingdoms rose, fell, argued about taxes, invented clocks, forgot poetry. But out there on the cliff, the light never flickered. Eventually, sailors stopped mentioning it altogether. Modern ships had their own lights now, stronger and colder, programmed to blink in patterns that left no room for mystery. But occasionally, when storms swallowed their satellites and silence filled the radio, they'd see it, that soft, pulsing glow on the horizon. And every time, the waves would calm. Every time, they'd make it home. No one questioned it too deeply. History, after all, is full of lighthouses that were never meant to exist. By the time people tried to visit again, this time with cameras, equipment, and that special kind of optimism reserved for documentaries, the cliff was gone. Or rather, it wasn't where they left it. They found only a stretch of calm water and the faint scent of salt and oil, as if the sea had tidied up after itself. The legend, of course, grew louder in absence. Some claimed Marin had finally stepped into the sea, shell in hand, to rest beside the dream she'd once listened to. Others believed she became the light itself, a steady pulse in the fog, guiding those who forgot how to find shore. A few insisted she still keeps watch in some small, hidden corner of the world, tending a lamp that never goes out. And occasionally, on very still nights, people swear they can hear the faint hum of her conversation with the waves. They say it sounds like comfort. Of course, the historians eventually got involved, because nothing ruins a good legend faster than someone with footnotes. One particularly persistent researcher claimed to have found Marin's logbook in a private collection. The handwriting matched, though several pages were odd. The ink shimmered faintly under light, and the margins were filled with short notes like, "The sea is dreaming of rain." Whales hummed in E minor tonight, lonely, but in a friendly way. Skeptics, predictably, dismissed it as forgery. Supporters, just as predictably, called it proof of the supernatural. Neither side noticed that the logbook itself smelled faintly of salt water, old salt water, from depths humans hadn't reached. And so, the legend settled into that comfortable space between truth and bedtime story. Every coastal town has one like it, a tale you tell when the night is too quiet, and you need to believe that something kind might still be out there, keeping watch. Marin's story became shorthand for gentleness, for the idea that even the endless can be soothed. Fishermen still drop seashells into the tide before sailing. Some say the sea keeps count. The modern lighthouse that stands there now, steel, efficient, entirely devoid of personality, still bears a small brass plaque on its foundation. No one knows who installed it. It reads simply, "For the keeper who listened." When I first came across that inscription in a dusty maritime archive, I thought it was sentimental nonsense. Then again, most history is sentimental nonsense we insist on remembering. And maybe that's the point. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that even the most enduring towers eventually crumble. But sometimes, the light keeps shining anyway. So tonight, if you find yourself listening to the sea, or to silence, which is really just the sea on mute, maybe you'll hear it too. A soft hum, a whisper, a voice saying, "I'm still here," and you'll know that somewhere, the lighthouse that never slept is still keeping watch. End of part 2. The Dreams of the Sea. Hey everyone, if you're still here, I'll assume you've either decided sleep is overrated, or you just enjoy the sound of quiet sentences lined up in a row. Either way, welcome back. Tonight, we're not walking the cliffs or climbing the tower. We're drifting outward, into the water itself, slowly, carefully, as if the tide were politely escorting us. Because before Marin faded from sight, she left us one last puzzle. The dreams she heard through that shell. And the sea, as it turns out, was a very busy dreamer. The first dreams she recorded were small ones. A sand dollar recalling the pattern of sunlight that once touched it. A shrimp rehearsing the same dance every night because it was afraid to forget the steps. Tiny things, repetitive, harmless, like the background thoughts of a planet that never gets quiet time. But as Marin kept listening, the dreams grew deeper. She wrote that some were slow enough to be measured in centuries, which, frankly, sounds exhausting. Still, she listened, because that's what she did. One of the oldest dreams came from the deep trenches, where light never bothered to visit. There, the water imagined warmth. It pictured itself as a lake in sunlight, not endless pressure and cold. For thousands of years, that dream kept looping, one bubble of comfort adrift in the dark. Marin called it the dream of maybe. Then there were the coral reefs, those patient architects of color. Their dreams were crowded, bright, slightly vain. They dreamed of fish that admired them and of currents that didn't rearrange their work every few hours. They even dreamed of being painted, which is both charming and a little self-aware. Sometimes, the sea dreamed of people, not individuals exactly, more like silhouettes walking along shores, leaving footprints it could erase at its leisure. It liked the idea of us, she said, though it found us noisy and a bit overconfident about boats. It didn't hate ships, of course. It simply considered them temporary opinions. One night, according to her notes, the sea dreamed it could speak directly. It tried forming a sentence with waves, syllables made of foam, punctuation supplied by gulls. The result, she wrote, was grammatically interesting but emotionally confused. The sea gave up halfway through and went back to humming. Historians later debated whether any of this could be literal. Some said Marin had simply fallen asleep to the sound of tides and written down her own dreams. Others pointed out that her descriptions matched real oceanic patterns discovered centuries later, currents that shifted exactly as she'd drawn them. Coincidence, maybe. Or maybe the sea really was trying to send a message through her, one gentle insomniac to another. Her final entries mention new kinds of dreams, ones that didn't belong to fish or waves, dreams of silence, places where the sea no longer reached, but still remembered the shape of itself. She described them like ghosts of coastlines, echoing through the water. Every shore, she wrote, leaves an aftertaste. That's the kind of sentence that makes academics nervous. It sounds poetic, which usually means it's true in ways we can't measure. By the time she wrote those lines, her handwriting had grown looser. You can almost feel her slowing down, not from age exactly, but from the steady rhythm of someone merging with what she loved. The last page stops mid-sentence. Tonight the sea dreamed of, and that's it. No ending, no flourish, just an unfinished thought still drifting somewhere under the surface. In the years that followed, sailors started reporting odd sounds through their hulls when anchored near the old coordinates. Not mechanical noise, more like humming. The long, low tones that seemed to match heartbeats. Engineers blamed resonance. The superstitious blamed Marin. The sea, characteristically, offered no comment. Every so often, oceanographers lower microphones into the deep to record natural sounds. Earthquakes, whales, the occasional confused dolphin, and sometimes, buried under all that, they catch something slower, a pulse that isn't quite biological, not quite mechanical. It repeats every few minutes, just enough to be almost a lullaby. They call it the sleeper frequency. No one can trace its origin, but if you overlay the signal onto a map of global currents, it lines up perfectly with the old shipping routes that once passed Marin's lighthouse. Coincidence again, or memory? Those two look identical when viewed through salt water. What fascinates me most is how ordinary the legend became. People stopped asking if it was true and started using it as shorthand for calm. You'll find cafes named the Lighthouse That Never Slept, You'll find a brand of bath salts, a children's book, a rather self-important spa, all using the same imagery. A lone tower, glowing softly, promising peace. History always gets commodified eventually, but maybe that's fine. If a myth has to survive in lavender packaging to keep existing, that's still survival. As for the dreams, well, they continue. Every wave that touches land carries a little echo of everything that's ever been whispered to it. It forgets quickly, but not completely. That's the comfort of water. Impermanence that still remembers you were there. So, if you ever stand by the shore at night and feel the odd urge to apologize to the tide, you're in good company. People have been doing that for centuries, just in case the sea's still listening, and perhaps it is, because the sound never really stopped. On recordings, on stormy nights, even in the hush between breaking waves, there's that same faint pattern. Slow, steady, patient, like breathing, like someone keeping the light. That's enough for now. Let's let the sea keep dreaming, and you can follow its example. Close your eyes. Picture that horizon. Soft, silver, unbothered. The lamp is still turning. The waves are still whispering. And somewhere far out there, the world is being quietly tended by a keeper who never left her post. End of part 3. The Tide That Remembered Names. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're hearing this, congratulations. Either you woke up halfway through the ocean's monologue, or you simply never left. Both are valid life choices. Tonight, the sea is quieter. It's that hour when even the gulls forget to complain. When the tide moves not out of duty, but out of habit. And that's where we'll stay for a while, tracing what came after Marin. The small, strange ways her light kept echoing. When the lighthouse finally disappeared, the villages along that coast noticed something curious. Boats that strayed near the old coordinates began returning with bits of driftwood carved with initials, letters that matched names of sailors long lost. The carvings were clean, as if done with care, not weather. Naturally, the locals did what people always do when faced with quiet miracles. They started a registry. They called it the Tide That Remembered Names. It filled slowly, each entry noting what was found and whose memory it seemed to carry. A plank marked HV for Henrik Voss, the cartographer who once dropped his shell. The cork inscribed EM. No record of who that was, but someone's aunt swore it matched her grandfather's initials, and that was enough. The sea has always been generous with ambiguity. The town clerks took their job seriously. Every recovered fragment was logged, dried, and politely thanked before being stored in the harbor office. At some point, they started leaving cups of fresh water beside the cabinet, just in case the pieces got thirsty. No one questioned this. Superstition, when handled gently, turns into routine. By the late 19th century, visiting sailors treated the registry like a guestbook for the lost. They'd read through the names, find one that looked familiar, and pour a bit of rum into the tide. Because if the sea was remembering, the least they could do was acknowledge the effort. Around then, a new keeper took over the rebuilt, thoroughly modern lighthouse. A man named Thorne. Square shoulders, efficient handwriting, and the emotional range of a well-maintained compass. He didn't believe in ghosts or glowing shells. He believed in kerosene and maintenance schedules. For the first few years, everything went splendidly. The lamps stayed lit. The storms behaved. The reports were immaculate. Then one evening, Thorne wrote an odd note in his logbook. Strange light on horizon soft, rhythmic not hours. He drew a small sketch, a faint pulse coming from the water itself. He wrote, possibly reflection. The next night he added, still reflecting. And then, reflections don't hum. After that, he stopped commenting, but he never missed a night shift again. Some said he became quieter, slower, as if matching pace with something unseen. He died there years later, at his desk, lamps still turning. The locals buried him facing the sea. By the 20th century, Marin's name had turned into folklore proper. Tour guides mentioned her between lunch breaks and ship schedules. Postcards showed a stylized woman holding a seashell like a microphone. Every summer, the children staged a play called The Keeper and the Sea, which mostly involved shouting at buckets of water. None of it was historically accurate, which is probably why people loved it. Meanwhile, the registry kept growing, even after the clerks retired and the cabinet warped from humidity. Someone always came by to dust it, and once a year, during the first calm night of spring, the townsfolk gathered on the pier to read the names aloud, not loudly, just enough for the tide to overhear. No one knows when the tradition started. It continues because stopping feels wrong. That's how most sacred habits survive. Mild social discomfort. In the late 1980s, a diver found something unexpected near the supposed site of Marin's Lighthouse. About 20 meters down, half buried in silt, was a lens housing from an older model lamp. Inside it, remarkably intact, was a single shell, white, spiraled, faintly luminous. Tests showed no phosphorus, no bioluminescence, no reasonable explanation. The researchers logged it, debated it, and placed it in a museum where fluorescent lighting ensured it would never glow again, except on rainy nights. Security footage occasionally showed the display case misting over, a dim pulse beneath the glass. The museum staff stopped commenting on it in official reports, but the janitors began leaving a small bowl of seawater nearby. Old habits, like old legends, adapt. As for the registry, it's digital now, of course. An online database run by volunteers who tag shipwreck data with soft melancholy. You can scroll through thousands of entries, each one a person, a place, or sometimes just an initial followed by the note found near calm water. Every few weeks, someone adds a new one. No one knows who does it. No one asks. And still, at the bottom of the homepage, a quiet tagline remains. The sea remembers. We reciprocate. There's a theory, unprovable, charming, that the hum Marin once heard has synced with global tides, a slow oscillation running through every current, too faint for instruments, too persistent for coincidence. Oceanographers dismiss it, naturally, but divers sometimes describe feeling watched, not in a sinister way, just regarded, like the water knows your name and is trying to pronounce it correctly. That would be very like the sea. Patient, imperfect, a bit sentimental after all these years. If you ever visit that coast, there's still a small wooden sign near the harbor. It's been repainted so often the letters are more tradition than wood. It reads, "Quiet voices carry farther." Below it, people leave shells, hundreds of them, collected from everywhere, different colors, different shapes. When the wind hits right, they rattle softly together, sounding almost like breath. No one claims ownership of the shrine. No one vandalizes it. Some things are left alone because we instinctively know they're already being tended. And maybe that's the final piece of the story. Not the woman, not the light, but the listening. Marin didn't conquer the sea or command it. She treated it like a creature capable of being understood. Centuries later, people still imitate her in small ways. checking the weather, thanking the waves, pausing before tossing something overboard. It's not grand, but it's enough. Empires fade, courtesy lingers. So, if tonight you hear water through an open window, a distant pipe, or just your own pulse, imagine it murmuring your name back to you. Not perfectly, maybe, but earnestly, because the tide, in its quiet, endless way, does remember. And sometimes, remembering is its own kind of light. End of part 4. The Long Night Currents. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're not, that's also fine. This story, like the sea itself, doesn't mind being half heard. Tonight, we're following what happens when a myth keeps living quietly in the background, long after everyone stops calling it a myth. By the early 21st century, navigation was no longer romantic. GPS satellites replaced stars, steel replaced oak, and lighthouses, once symbols of lonely duty, were mostly turned into gift shops or boutique rental properties. Progress, naturally, loves good lighting. Still, some old sailors refused to let the past dissolve completely. They kept compasses in their cabins, just in case, as if a global positioning network could wake up one morning and decide it was tired, and more than a few, while adjusting their courses, would murmur a phrase under their breath, a habit passed down with no explanation. Something like, "Keep the light steady, Marin." Ask them who Marin was, and you'd get shrugs. "Oh, you know, the sea's keeper," they'd say, in the same tone you might use to describe the weather. Not belief, just acknowledgement. Cargo captains crossing the North Atlantic sometimes reported odd sonar readings. Small, regular pulses with no known source. Marine scientists called them acoustic anomalies. The sailors called them her heartbeat. And of course, they were both probably right, in their own ways. One captain, a Norwegian named Ulrich Svensson, kept a private log of these encounters. He'd write down every coordinate where the pulse appeared. Then note, soft, rhythmic, like an engine idling miles away. Crew calm, sea calm, no fear. He once told a journalist that it felt as though the ocean itself was breathing beneath the hull. Slow, deliberate, patient. Then he smiled and added, which, to be fair, it's been doing for a few billion years. Ulrich retired in 2008, moved inland, and still claimed he could feel the tide under the floorboards. Doctors blamed it on blood pressure. He blamed it on sentimentality. Neither diagnosis was wrong. Meanwhile, oceanographers kept gathering data, blissfully unaware they were documenting a bedtime story. Deep-sea microphones recorded that same faint oscillation, a near-infinite hum that didn't belong to whales or machinery. They mapped it, charted it, labeled it persistent unknown frequency. Some interns nicknamed it the lighthouse tone. Naturally, the department head made them change it to something more serious. Continuous low-level submarine acoustic phenomenon, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, "We don't know, but we'd rather sound confident about it." The data was archived, published, and ignored because mystery, like moisture, tends to be classified as background noise, but not everyone dismissed it. In 2011, a quiet group of researchers in Cornwall started an online project called The Listening Tide. They built underwater microphones, set them along the western coasts of Europe, and invited anyone to stream the audio live. Relaxing, the website promised. Real-time ocean ambience. It was wildly popular. People used it for meditation, for sleep, for background during emails. They'd listen for hours, unaware that buried under the hiss of currents was that same old rhythm, the hum that once guided Marin's life. Every few months, a listener would comment something like, "I swear I heard someone whisper my name," to which the moderators would politely reply, "That's probably the tide." And that was that. Occasionally, ships still reported strange glows beneath the surface, a pale shimmer that followed their wake. The Coast Guard chalked it up to bioluminescent plankton, because of course they did. It's easier to explain the sea when you keep it strictly biological. Anything else implies empathy, and that's too much paperwork. Still, the glow often appeared on calm nights, around the anniversary of Marin's last recorded light. Coincidence, probably. But then, coincidence is just a polite word for repetition that makes us uncomfortable. One of the more poetic versions of the legend says that Marin's light didn't disappear at all. It simply changed medium, that her signal became one with the sea, refracted and reframed into a vibration that could only be felt, not seen. A light made of sound, or perhaps a kindness that learned to travel differently. You can think of it as folklore, or as physics having an emotional day. Both interpretations are fine. There's also the matter of the Seaflower expedition in 2017, a small research vessel, crewed by students from Reykjavik, reported picking up intermittent melodic frequencies during a calm spell near the same longitude as Marin's last position. Their instruments recorded it. The clip lasted about 3 minutes. Soft, rhythmic, almost like someone humming through glass. The audio was uploaded to a small academic server, then promptly lost when funding ran out, but fragments survive. Every so often, someone rediscovers them and overlays them with whale calls or ambient synthesizers. They end up on playlists titled Songs of the Deep or Liminal Ocean Dreams. No one knows what they're listening to. They just know it feels kind. So yes, maybe the story of Marin didn't end when her lighthouse fell. Maybe it diffused. Maybe every bit of comfort she ever offered to the waves is still circling the globe in long, slow loops. The sea, after all, recycles everything, including affection. And maybe that's why some nights, when you're far from shore and everything is quiet, the world seems to hum around you, not loudly, just enough to remind you that silence is never absolute. It's as though the ocean learned her voice, kept it, and now uses it to soothe whatever drifts too far from the light. These days, no one officially tends the lighthouse. It's automatic, solar-powered, quietly efficient. But when engineers visit for maintenance, some swear they find small shells lined up along the base of the lamp housing. Not many, just 2 or 3, perfectly arranged, always clean, never covered in dust. They log it as minor vandalism. Then they put the shells back, because deep down, everyone prefers to leave certain mysteries uncorrected. The registry, too, still grows. Now there's an app. It lets users submit the names of anyone lost at sea, or anyone who simply loved it. The interface plays a soft wave sound after each entry. No ads, no notifications, just water, remembering things. At last count, over 4 million names were recorded, more every day, because even in a century obsessed with progress, people still want to be remembered by something that listens. If you're listening to this near sleep, let your thoughts drift like small boats on that long, slow current. Every name ever spoken into the tide eventually joins it. Every kindness ripples farther than you think. And somewhere, between signal and silence, a woman who never stopped keeping watch is still there, guiding whatever needs guiding, listening to whoever still whispers back. So, If tonight feels too quiet, don't worry. The world has never truly gone silent. It's just breathing slower, waiting for you to rest. End of part 5. The Cartographer's Promise. Hey everyone, welcome back. If you've made it this far, you're either deeply committed or you fell asleep somewhere around the glowing seashell and your brain's just playing along. Either way, no judgment. Tonight, we're not looking forward. We're drifting backward, tracing the quiet footprints left by Marin's story on the people who once tried to measure the world. Before the age of satellites and straight lines, map making was mostly guesswork in decorative handwriting. Every coastline was a rumor, and most accurate charts were really just polite suggestions. Cartographers like to add sea monsters to fill empty space, because, naturally, nothing unsettles investors like a blank page. One of those early map makers was Henrik Voss, the man who once dropped his shell into the sea. You might remember him from earlier, a detail easily missed, like a faint star on a cloudy night. Henrik wasn't famous. He drew maps for small harbors, sold them for smaller wages, and spent an unreasonable amount of time staring at waves as if they might eventually hold still. After Marin vanished, Henrik changed the way he drew coastlines. He started leaving small gaps, deliberate breaks between headlands. He called them listening spaces. His apprentices assumed he was losing his grip, but his reasoning was simple. If the sea keeps talking, he said, the map should have room for replies. It's not a principle you'll find in modern navigation software, but it's a pleasant one. Historians later found that Henrik's maps were oddly durable. Where others tore or faded, his ink stayed sharp. Theories abound. Special oils, good luck, divine bureaucracy. But my favorite explanation comes from a note scribbled in one corner of an unfinished chart. Paper remembers salt, a phrase both meaningless and strangely correct. Over time, copies of his listening maps spread quietly along coastal towns. Sailors claimed that tracing the gaps with your finger before a voyage kept storms at bay. Ship captains began marking their safe returns with tiny dots of candle wax, small lights pressed into parchment. An old tradition, unofficial, unrecorded, but persistent. By the 18th century, those dots had turned into symbols on official charts. A light visible at distance, lighthouse present, keeper's post, all perfectly mundane, and all tracing back, indirectly, to one woman who refused to sleep through her shifts. There's a faint irony there. Empires rose, colonized, and argued about longitude, and somewhere beneath those grand ambitions, the quiet work of a single lighthouse keeper shaped how the world measured comfort. Every map maker since has been, in some way, drawing echoes of her horizon. Even modern digital charts, those neat blue lines you pinch zoom on your phone, still carry a faint residue of that idea, that every edge deserves light. Of course, as centuries passed, most cartographers forgot Henrik Voss. He left no heirs, just a few brittle pages and one peculiar rumor. According to a 1732 maritime journal, a fisherman found a sealed jar washed ashore near his old home. Inside was a rolled-up scrap of vellum showing a stretch of unmarked sea with the words, "Here, the tide keeps promises." It could have been anyone's handwriting, but the ink had that same stubborn brightness, and the vellum, unlike the jar, was dry. By the late 19th century, romantic poets discovered him, as they often do with mildly tragic people. They wrote verses about the man who mapped silence, and included far too many adjectives about myths. His name briefly appeared in academic footnotes, then drifted back into obscurity, where it's more comfortable, but the idea stayed. The notion that every chart of the known world should leave space for what can't be known. Modern surveyors might call it margin for error. Henrik would have called it courtesy. Even now, a few nautical charts still show small, featureless patches labeled unsurveyed. Most assume it's due to depth, current, or funding, but there's an older superstition among sailors. Those blank spaces belong to the sea herself. They say if you fill them in, you'll lose your sense of direction. Not immediately, but gradually, like forgetting the way home from memory instead of distance. So far, no one's been eager to test it. Museums today keep several of Henrik's original works under glass. Visitors shuffle past, reading little plaques about early hydrographic experimentation, and very few notice the faint salt marks along the edges. Under certain lights they glimmer, tiny crystals that refuse to fade, as though the sea, in its infinite pettiness, insists on signing his work. There's something oddly comforting about that the ocean keeps track, not just of ships and storms, but of the people who tried to draw her portrait with trembling hands and too little ink. One curator once described the maps as quiet, not empty. Quiet, and if you listen closely, she claimed, you can almost hear a faint hum from the display case. She said it softly, like a secret, and then changed the subject to humidity control, because admitting you hear the sea in a museum is how funding disappears. These days, cartography has moved on to satellites and sensors, but even those vast, mathematical scans still show a kind of texture, a gentle unevenness where the light bends differently. Experts call it data noise. Poets would call it memory. Maybe that's Henrik's final joke, a man whose greatest achievement was leaving gaps large enough for myths to hide inside. And somewhere within those gaps, if you tilt the map of the world just right, you can almost imagine a small figure at a lantern's base, polishing glass, humming softly, and still keeping watch. Not because anyone told her to, but because habit, once kind, becomes eternal. So when you next see a map, any map, and your eyes drift toward the blank corners, remember that they were left empty on purpose. For voices, for echoes, for light that doesn't fade, even when the lamp goes out. That's where we'll leave it for now. Adrift between lines of ink and waves of sound, in that small, merciful space where the world pauses to listen. End of part 6. The Sea and the Sleepers. Hey everyone, if you can still hear this, you've made it to the end of the tide. If you can't, that's fine too. The story will keep floating until you wake. We followed Maren, Henrik, and the long hum that threaded itself through centuries of salt and glass. But this part isn't about them anymore. It's about you and the quiet world you're lying in. Every ocean has a surface rhythm, but underneath that is something slower. Currents that circle the globe in patterns so large they take decades to complete a single breath. Scientists chart them, name them, model them. The sea, as usual, doesn't notice. It just keeps turning. And if you've ever fallen asleep near water, by a river, a bath, a half-remembered dream, you felt that same current tugging gently at your thoughts. That's the tide of sleepers, the invisible pull that reminds every drifting mind that rest isn't absence, it's participation. Long ago, sailors used to say that dreams traveled along the sea's surface, hopping from one sleeper to another like lantern light skipping across waves. That's why people woke with stories they'd never lived, and why some nights felt crowded even when you were alone. They called those dream routes sleep currents. No one mapped them. Of course, you can't chart a yawn. Still, the idea lingered. Because even the most pragmatic mind suspects that quiet connects things more completely than sound ever could. If Marin could see the world now, screens glowing in every window, lighthouses turned into hotels, she'd probably smile the small, polite smile of someone who's seen all this before. Light is light. After all, it doesn't care what shape it takes. She'd notice, too, that people still talk to the night when they think no one's listening, that we still stand at the edges of things, piers, balconies, deadlines, and wait for the dark to answer back. It usually does, not in words, but in that small loosening that happens right before sleep, when everything finally stops arguing with itself. Out at sea, modern sailors still keep night logs, digital, neat, time-stamped. Yet every so often a line appears that doesn't fit the data. Light on horizon unconfirmed, sea unusually calm, crew restful, nothing remarkable. But the phrasing never changes. It's as if the ocean itself occasionally writes in the margins, reminding them that observation can also be gratitude. You could say the same for dreaming. That sleep is a kind of map making, the mind tracing coastlines of things it can't quite hold. Every blank spot you drift across tonight is just another listening space, left open for the world to fill in gently. If you've carried too much noise today, let the sea have it. It's good at keeping secrets. It has billions of years of practice. Somewhere, far out beyond any shipping lane, the water still moves in that slow heartbeat. The hum is still there, steady, patient, perfectly indifferent to time. And in that rhythm, all the lost names, all the small kindnesses, all the half-remembered promises still circulate, bright as plankton, weightless as breath. You're part of it now, just another sleeper folded into the current. You don't have to steer. You don't even have to stay awake. The tide knows what to do. So, as you settle deeper, imagine the light of that old lighthouse turning once more, casting its quiet arc across the water, not to warn, not to command, just to say, I'm still here. Let that be enough. Let it carry you until morning decides to arrive. And if, somewhere in the drift between waking and rest, you hear a voice like a soft hum through glass, don't be alarmed. It's just the sea, checking in, making sure the keeper's shift is never lonely. That's all for tonight. Sleep well, traveler. The lighthouse hasn't slept in centuries, so you can. Good night.